complete Tower Bridge appeared in Guy Ritchie's 2009 movie Sherlock Holmes in a climactic scene involving a struggle with the film's villain, Lord Blackwood. The bridge crosses the River Thames in London, the British capital, and is one of the most famous structures in the world. It's recognized and admired all over the globe as a national aesthetic and engineering masterpiece of the Victorian age. Construction of Tower Bridge began in 1886, and the bridge opened on June 30, 1894. It became popular because of its appearance and because it was toll-free. The nearby Tower subway tunnel charged a toll for its use while the bridge did not. Because of this, intelligent Victorians soon abandoned the Tower subway tunnel and started crossing the bridge regularly instead. The bridge was so popular that by 1898, the Tower subway tunnel closed due to a lack of revenue. The two structures are called Tower Subway and Tower Bridge due to their close proximity to the Tower of London, the ancient fortress and prison on the north bank of the River Thames. At the press of a button, the two halves of the bridge could be raised up to their full angle of 86 degrees each. This whole process took about 1 minute. Speed was important on the River Thames when ships needed quick access to the London docks further upriver. From its opening in 1894 until 1975, Tower Bridge was opened using steam-powered hydraulic engines. There were 2 engines, one to raise each side of the bridge. In 1976, the bridge's original steam-powered engines were removed and replaced with more modern electrical ones. They still raise and lower the bridge using hydraulic power, but don't require as much maintenance.
What could she possibly need?
Doesn't matter.
Alibi? A beard? A human canoe? She could sit on your back and paddle you up the Thames.
The Thames, which is crossed by Tower Bridge, also plays a role in the canonical Sign of the Four novel and thus various media adaptations. It is the longest river entirely in England. Parts of the 1890 novel The Sign of the Four by Arthur Conan Doyle take place around the River Thames, as does the 1987 film starring Jeremy Brett. The Port of London became the central trading post for the vast British Empire in the 19th century. More docks were built in the face of competition from riverside wharves, who built huge warehouses downriver from Tower Bridge. Most of these warehouses now house riverside apartments and shopping malls. River and canal trade expanded despite competition from the new railway network. However, steam-powered cargo vessels appeared on the river alongside traditional Thames sailing barges and lighters.
Pile on the coal, Stoker! We must have her, even if we burn the boat!
However, some Victorian innovations had environmental impacts, such as the widespread introduction of the flushing water closet, with sewers discharging straight into the Thames. This turned the river into a vast open sewer and caused the period to be known as the Great Stink. The once thriving fishing industry died, as did thousands of Londoners, of cholera because their main water supply was now polluted. Nothing was done until a particularly hot summer made living near the Thames unbearable. Fumes from the river penetrated the Houses of Parliament and made work there unbearable, so in 1864, 2 enormous sewers were laid along the Thames to collect and divert the sewage downstream to Beckton and Crossness, where sewage farms were set up. At the same time, the Metropolitan line was installed and the Victoria embankments were built on top, reducing the width of the Thames and improving the depth and speed of flow of the water. During Victorian times, there was also an explosion of interest in the Thames as a leisure resource, and many of the activities enjoyed on the river today began in this era. The new railways, which reached towns on the river such as Reading, Oxford, and Windsor, provided a popular day out for those who could afford it. Rowing boat firms sprung up with boats for hire, and the river filled with small boats during the summer. Rowing in particular became a popular pastime, and clubs increased, with regattas becoming annual events. The world-famous Henley Regatta dates from 1839 and still takes place every year at Henley in late June and early July. Represented by Inspector Lestrade, comrade to Sherlock Holmes, and the home of the London Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard has a rich history and to this day serves Greater London. The London Police Force was created in 1829 by an act introduced in Parliament by Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, giving the name peelers and bobbies to policemen. These new police superseded the old system of watchmen. By 1839, these men had replaced the Bow Street runners, who enforced the decisions of magistrates, and the river police, who worked to prevent crime along the Thames. When the Yard set out its first plainclothes police agents in 1842, the public was uncomfortable with these spies on the streets. However, the force's role in several important cases and the charisma of many of its detectives helped it win the people's trust. In 1877, 4 out of the 5 heads for the detective branch were brought to trial for conspiring with criminals in a betting scheme. To repair the force's tarnished reputation, Howard Vincent submitted a restructuring proposal to the force and was soon appointed Director of Criminal Investigations. He reorganized Scotland Yard, strengthening its central unit, and with that, the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, a unit of plainclothes police detectives, was born. In 1888, one of Scotland Yard's most durable detectives, Frederick Porter Wensley, joined the force. His career was highlighted with many landmark cases, including the murder of 32-year-old Frenchwoman Emmeline Gerard, also known as the Bloody Belgium case. On November 2, 1917, street sweepers found Gerard's torso along with a note reading Bloody Belgium. Wensley questioned her lover, Louis Voisin, asking him to write the message Bloody Belgium. Voisin made the same spelling error found in the original note, sealing his guilt. The force moved to a new building on the Victorian Embankment in 1890, and it became known as New Scotland Yard. In 1967, the need for a larger and more modern headquarters caused a move to its present site at Broadway, and it is also known as New Scotland Yard. (221B) Baker Street is the London home of Sherlock Holmes in the Canon series and in most adaptations. The house first appeared in A Study in Scarlet when Holmes and Watson rented it from the landlady, Mrs. Hudson. Baker Street in Holmes's time was a high-class residential district, and Holmes's apartment was probably part of a Georgian terrace. When the Sherlock Holmes stories were first published, street numbers in Baker Street only went up to 100, which is probably why Sir Arthur Conan Doyle chose a higher street number in order to prevent anyone's actual residence from being affected by the story's popularity. The section north of Marylebone Road near Regent's Park, now including 221 Baker Street, was known in Conan Doyle's lifetime as Upper Baker Street. In 1835, the first permanent exhibition of Madame Tussaud's waxworks was opened on Baker Street. The museum moved just around the corner to Marylebone Road in 1884. Baker Street is served by the London Underground, or the Baker Street Tube Station, which opened in 1863. It's one of the world's oldest surviving underground stations. Today, 221B is home to the popular Sherlock Holmes Museum.
Mrs. Hudson, we're off to Dartmoor!
For Holmes, the countryside with its scattered houses and isolated communities was a place where crime could be committed with impunity. Baskerville Hall, home of Sir Henry Baskerville, is located in Grimpen, Dartmoor in England. And it wasn't just his famous battle with Jack Stapleton and the fearsome Hound of the Baskervilles that happened far from the foggy, cobbled streets of the capital city. In The Adventure of Silver Blaze, published in 1892, the disappearance of a champion racehorse also takes Holmes to Dartmoor.
The Hound! Come on, Watson, quick!
Dartmoor is an area of moorland in South Devon, England. Protected by national park status, it covers 954 square kilometers, or 368 square miles.
Dartmoor Prison, isolated from the outside world by walls of granite.
The 1946 Sherlock Holmes film Dressed to Kill, starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, features Dartmoor Prison as the location where 3 music boxes were made that contain a secret code for a criminal gang. The movie is based on the short story The Adventure of the Dancing Men. In 1850, the first convicts transferred from convict prison ships on the Thames and at Gosport. Most were invalids, imbeciles, one-armed and one-legged men, and others with chest complaints who it was thought would benefit from the fresh Dartmoor air. Cast iron cells arranged back-to-back were constructed by artisan convicts under the supervision of contractors. These were superseded by stone cells before finally the older prisons were demolished and replaced by the buildings you see today, also built by convicts under artisan warders' supervision. They were occupied by the worst criminals in the land. In Dartmoor today, there are over 450 miles of public right-of-way, so walkers and cyclists have lots to discover, and you can also go climbing or canoeing. The area is also known for its wild ponies and pubs.
All right, Baines, will you stop here, please, because this is rather a good view.
There's is the room. Going like the devil.
Boats can be seen throughout adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes novels because they played a large role in the novels themselves. In The Sign of the Four, Holmes and Watson chased two suspected murderers in a police steam launch. Despite the development of the steam engine, the merchant sailing clipper reigned supreme throughout the Victorian era. Clippers were designed for driving through bad seas. In favorable weather, they could reach up to 400 miles a day. Smaller clippers would race from China to bring back the new season's tea crop and arrive in London in 90 days. Eventually, the invention of the iron screw propeller saved fuel and gave the steamship more thrust, but sailing ships still had the advantage of free power. In 1904, Britain finally launched more steamships than sailing ships. Bicycles were being developed through the early part of the 19th century. Velocipedes with pedals on the front wheel, penny farthings, and tricycles were a few of the models that were on the market by the mid-1800s. The modern safety bicycle with two wheels was introduced in 1885, and bicycle riding began as a craze. However, it soon became a cheap mode of transport for the ordinary working man by serving as a way to travel a bit farther to get a job or even to find a wife. This also introduced a revolution in women's clothes with the introduction of garments like bloomers. The 1880s saw the introduction of a new design for the horse bus, the garden seat bus, which had forward-facing seats and a curved staircase at the rear, making boarding easier. Aside from small changes like the introduction of acetylene lighting in the 1890s, the horse-drawn bus remained largely unchanged throughout the latter part of the 19th century. Development of the horse bus was limited by the load that two horses could pull. One way of increasing the number of passengers that could be carried was to run the vehicle on rails set into the road, creating the horse tram. By pulling a carriage on steel rails, friction was reduced, making it easier for a pair of horses to pull a heavier passenger load, increasing profits. In 1870, London's first tram service began between Brighton and Kennington on steel rails laid flush with the road surface. Being able to carry more passengers than a bus while using the same number of horses meant that tram's fares could be dropped. Along with early morning workers' tickets at half price on the railways, this brought public transport within reach of more working people for the first time and enabled them to live further from their workplaces in the crowded city. Trams were also slightly faster than horse buses, traveling at 6 miles per hour rather than 4. The horses that originally pulled the trams were replaced by the late 1880s, first by steam-driven trams and then in the 1890s with electric ones. The most common cab used in Victorian times was the hansom cab, named after its founder, Mr. A.J. Hansom. It was a nimble two-wheeled carriage with a low center of gravity that was able to turn on a dime. It is known for being used by Holmes and Watson in their travels as it was the perfect size for no more than 2 people, and it was a quick and efficient way to arrive at crime scenes. Of the 60 recorded cases of Sherlock Holmes available today, 19 contain specific references to hansoms, with Holmes specifically taking one 8 times. The view from a hansom was much better than that afforded by the side windows of a four-wheeler. The hansom had side windows placed just over the tops of the wheels and an entirely open front. A shout or whistle could bring one trotting up if there is not already one at a nearby curb. Cabs could be hired by distance or time, sometimes at the passenger's choice, and items like luggage and waiting time cost extra at a fixed scale of charges. However, the hansom cab was considered a racy vehicle, a sort of gentleman's sports car, and it was not considered proper for upper-class ladies to ride in them. Any young woman seen riding in a hansom was judged to be of loose morals, probably due to the 2-person capacity. Irene Adler, although an adventuress, knew how to conduct herself in a scandal in Bohemia. When her fiancé came for her in a hansom on their wedding day, she sent him on immediately. She then took a much more acceptable landau, an action that undoubtedly did not detract from Holmes's estimation of her as the woman. The clarence, or 4-wheeled carriage, was the best way to transport more than 2 people, but its common name was the growler, thanks to the noise its wheels made on the cobblestone streets. In many movies and TV shows depicting the Victorian era, you often see growlers waiting at railway stations picking up arrivals. They carry loads of luggage and people with ease. In addition to London's continued growth, new railway termini in the 1850s brought more people there. Traffic congestion became a serious problem, and one solution was the construction of the first underground railways. Among the most vocal advocates for a solution to London's traffic problems was Charles Pearson, solicitor to the City of London. His idea was to relocate slum dwellers to new suburbs built to house them and to provide cheap rail travel for them to get to work. He merged with another group to establish the Metropolitan Railway Company in 1854. The world's first underground railway, the Metropolitan, opened on January 10, 1863, and was immediately popular. On its first day, almost 40,000 passengers were carried between Paddington and Farringdon. In the face of continued London congestion, another tunnel was opened under the Thames in 1870, from Tower Hill to Tooley Street. The Tower subway was constructed by the engineer Peter Barlow. The newly dug section of tunnel was then lined with cast iron segments to form a cylinder, or tube, which is where the name comes from. A steam locomotive wasn't possible in such a confined space, and the only other solution at the time was to haul the carriages with cable traction. This led to its financial failure despite successful construction. The railway closed in November 1870 after only a few months' operation. However, the technology had been successfully developed for deep-level tunneling. By the 1880s, electricity offered a clean and efficient way of powering the railway. It was the development of a reliable electric motor and a means of transferring the power from the generator to a moving train, which made possible the construction of the world's first deep-level electric railway, the City in South London, which opened in 1890.
Right. You four stay here. And the rest of you come with me.
Inspector G. Lestrade is a Scotland Yard detective who appears in several of the Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle used the name of an acquaintance from his days at the University of Edinburgh, a St. Lucian whom he disliked. Inspector Lestrade served to represent the common policeman of the 1890s in contrast to Holmes, most likely working at New Scotland Yard on the Victorian Embankment. Dennis Hoey played Lestrade in the 1940s film series alongside Basil Rathbone's Holmes and Nigel Bruce's Watson. His role was mostly for comic relief, sharing the role of a bumbling old fool with Watson. The stories created an image of the Scotland Yard detectives as bumbling, unsuccessful agents of the Crown.
No, Lady Margaret came in alone. Well, I was in my compartment just now having a bite to eat, and I heard a crash in here. Crash? It's locked. I knocked and there was no answer. So you just stood here twiddling your thumbs. Brilliant.
Contrarily, Scotland Yard's detectives typically investigated serious felonies, especially murders. This is most likely because by the 1840s, the death penalty was only routinely applied for convicted murderers, and the government wanted seasoned officers to help investigate and prosecute those cases. Those cases required flexibility in terms of time and location that regular police constables were unable to perform because they were restricted to their beats. To gain information, detectives got to know the criminal element in London by visiting pubs and races, employing informers, and even using the newspapers to find information and discover possible frauds.
Hello, hello, hello.
Charles Dickens published interviews with them in his journal Household Words and praised their talent for catching criminals, writing, "If thieving be an art, thief-taking is a science." In his novel Bleak House, Dickens based the character Inspector Bucket on real-life Detective Inspector Charles Frederick Field. In Dickens' writing, in contrast to Doyle's, Scotland Yard detectives were portrayed as intelligent, thoughtful, and judicious men with a touch of mystery about them. Holmes's valued companion, Dr. John H. Watson, is a medical doctor who served in the British Army Medical Corps in Afghanistan, but was discharged following injury. A study in scarlet details his involvement in the battle at Maiwand on July 27, 1880, while attached to the 66th Foot, and of his wounding by a bullet fired from a Jazile. The battle took place west of Kandahar in southern Afghanistan and involved British troops and Indian troops of the Bombay Army against Afghan regular troops and tribesmen. The generals were General Burroughs against Ayub Khan. The British and Indian forces were made up mostly of native Indian regiments from the three presidency armies, the Bengal, the Bombay, and the Madras armies, along with smaller regional forces. Indian regiments were brigaded with British regiments for deployment in the field. The priority of the British Army surgeon was to treat the wounds and illness of the British and Indian servicemen, but in the aftermath of battle, medical staff would see if anything could be done for survivors of both sides, though this could be dangerous because some Ghazis would feign death and shoot at their enemy or draw a knife in a last effort. In more peaceable moments, hospitals and dispensaries would be set up for the Afghan population. In October 1879, Dr. Charles Owen was ordered to set up a charitable dispensary in Kabul, and as the population gradually became more trusting, he received up to 200 patients a day. He wrote, "Almost every variety of disease is to be met with here. Syphilia in a virulent form is very prevalent. Leprosy exists to a large extent among the Hazaras and among Kabylis. It is very frequent to find a small sore breakout on the toes, which is rapidly followed by a kind of melting away of the whole toe. Eye diseases, rheumatism, and asthma are very prevalent." The Second Anglo-Afghan War was fought between the United Kingdom and the Emirate of Afghanistan from 1878 to 1880. The war ended after the British emerged victorious against the Afghan rebels, and the Afghans agreed to let the British attain all of their geopolitical objectives from the Treaty of Gandamak. Most of the British and Indian soldiers then withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Afghans were permitted to maintain internal sovereignty, but they had to cede control of their nation's foreign relations to the British. Professor James Moriarty, the arch-enemy of the famous detective Sherlock Holmes, was a mathematics professor who became the world's only consulting criminal. His genius is equal to, if not greater than that of Sherlock Holmes himself. Despite only appearing in 2 stories, Moriarty is considered to be the most dangerous criminal that Holmes ever encountered. In the short story The Adventure of the Final Problem, during a fight with Holmes above the Reichenbach Falls, Moriarty and supposedly Holmes fell to their deaths. The real-life criminal Adam Worth, who lived from 1844 to 1902, is sometimes cited as the inspiration for Moriarty. Adam Worth was born in Germany but raised in the United States. He began his criminal career during the American Civil War when he became a bounty jumper, joining a New York regiment to gain the enlistment bounty of $1,000 offered before deserting and enlisting in another regiment. Worth became the most successful safecracker and bank robber in the city of New York. Hoping to escape Pinkerton detectives, in 1869 he borrowed or stole the name of Henry J. Raymond, late founder-editor of the New York Times, and sailed to England, where he transformed himself into an elegant English gentleman with a home on Piccadilly, a steam yacht, racehorses, and an international syndicate of robbers and forgers. For years, he drove the world's police forces to distraction with well-planned, bloodlessly executed crimes all the way to Port Elizabeth in South Africa without ever leaving incriminating evidence. Unlike Moriarty, Worth was eventually arrested by police, deserted by his accomplices, betrayed by an old rival, and spent 5 years in a Belgian jail. Also differing from Moriarty, Worth was completely opposed to violence. According to William Pinkerton, in all his criminal career, he was always proud that he never committed a robbery where the use of firearms had to be used, nor had he ever escaped or attempted to escape from custody by force or jeopardizing the life of an official, claiming that a man with brains had no right to carry firearms, that there was always a better way through the quick exercise of the brain. It is said that Sir Robert Anderson, Metropolitan Police Assistant Commissioner, referred to Worth as the Napoleon of the criminal world, a description also given to Moriarty. Interestingly enough, Worth also befriended William Pinkerton, the detective who spent decades hunting him, while the same cannot be said for Holmes and Moriarty. George Boole is also seen as part of the inspiration for Moriarty. He was the first professor of mathematics at Queen's College and is also widely seen as one of the fathers of computer science. Boole helped establish modern symbolic logic, in whose algebra of logic, now called Boolean algebra, is basic to the design of digital computer circuits. In 1847, he published a pamphlet, Mathematical Analysis of Logic, in which he argued persuasively that logic should be allied with mathematics, not philosophy. (1880s) women's clothing featured tightly fitting bodices with very narrow sleeves and high necklines, often trimmed at the wrist with white frills or lace. At the beginning of the decade, the emphasis was at the back of the skirt, featuring ruching, flouncing, and embellishments such as bows and thick fabrics and trims. The mid-1880s saw a brief revival of the bustle, which was so exaggerated that the derriere protruded horizontally from the small of the back. By the end of the 1880s, the bustle disappeared. Hair was worn in tight, close curls on the top of the head, and hats and caps were correspondingly small and neat to fit on top of this hairstyle. In the early part of the 1890s, women wore tight bodices with high collars and narrow sleeves, much as they had done in the previous decade. From about 1893, however, sleeves started expanding into a leg of mutton shape, which was tight at the lower arm and puffed out at the upper arm. Wide shoulders were fashionable, and horizontal decoration on the bodice further exaggerated the line. Skirts were worn in a full-length, simple A-line. Masculine styles and tailoring were increasingly popular, and women sometimes sported a shirt collar and tie, particularly when playing golf or out walking. For members of the gentry like Holmes and Watson, fashion was also an important display of status. The late Victorian era was humming with activity as the Industrial Revolution hit full stride, bringing revolutionary technologies and mass-produced products to the market. The manner in which people worked and lived was forever altered. These advancements include electric sewing machines in factory settings, providing access to ready-to-wear fashion. With clothing being manufactured in factories and sold via department stores and mail-order catalog, there is no longer a need to have men's clothing expensively tailored or sewn at home. Now, nearly every man could stock a respectable wardrobe without forking over his whole paycheck. Although the wealthiest gentlemen in aristocracy did continue a demand for custom-tailored garments for superior fit and exclusivity. For men in the Victorian era, lounge suits were becoming increasingly popular. They were often slim and jackets were worn open or partially undone to reveal the high buttoning waistcoat and watch chain. Collars were stiff and high with their tips turned over into wings. Neckties were either the knotted four-in-hand or versions of the bow tie tied around the collar. The three-piece lounge suit was very popular and regularly worn from the 1890s onwards, and it became increasingly common to have creases at the front of the trousers. Hair was cut short and usually parted at the side. Heavy mustaches were common, and older men still wore mustaches, while some men began to go clean-shaven. Later Holmes stories, like His Last Bow, take place in the time before the First World War, the Edwardian era of fashion. Dressing as a man in the 1910s during the Edwardian era is not very different from today. Men's Edwardian fashion included suits during the day, formal tailcoats for evening, and slightly more casual attire and sportswear for sporting events, with the rise in popularity in sports like hunting, yachting, cricket, and polo. On the other end of the spectrum, poor families owned very few everyday outfits, and if they were lucky, some nicer clothes to wear to church or on other special occasions. Many outfits were bought second-hand and were passed down through the family and mended and patched for as long as possible. Poor and working-class clothing had to be practical in order for work and in order to last a long time. They were often made from wool or cotton in dark colors, as this was cheaper and the dirt didn't show as much. Shoes also had to last a long time. Some people wore heavy boots with thick hobnailed soles. Women wore caps and bonnets not just to be respectable, but to keep hair from getting caught in machines and to fend off dirt and head lice. Poor children often wore patched and mended clothes that had been bought second-hand or passed down through the family. Not all families could afford shoes for their children, so some had to go barefoot even in the winter. Poor women's clothing was very different from the luxurious outfits of upper-class women, consisting of rags and cheap cloth. Professions such as factory work, domestic service, and prostitution also determined the attire for poor women.
Fare thee well.